All right, guys, so here is a 5-minute update. One of the things I did was I took a small piece, about 3.5 millimeters, off the base of my tail to shorten it. I found it was a bit disproportionate. The general rule is it should be as tall as it is distance to here. You should have the same distance from the middle of the tail to this tip as you do from this tip to this tip. It should be very close. If this is bigger, consider shrinking it. In this case, partly because it's not going to have tail control in the initial version, I want to make it very simple. Now, this is looking pretty sleek. You can see now with my doors, they're done. It's really just taped together, so the fit isn't the best. But really, the fit of the individual pieces is actually very, very good. The box is nice and square, and I'm liking that. Everything sits the way it should. I'm not seeing a big wobble in it or a big, crooked nature. No, it's quite straight. So then the next thing was landing gear. I had considered a couple of different kinds of landing gear. So what I've done is I've put up a little foam spring inside and then taped it closed. I actually recommend this because it makes it really easy to remove, and it's nice and light and it's easy to do. Landing gear tends to get damaged, so I'm just taping it on, and I'll keep doing it like that. And that way, if it does get damaged, it's the most likely thing to get damaged, really, and it's the easiest to repair, therefore. So I basically went with a stiff base here at the bottom, so the whole top spar of the landing gear here, the outer leg, is built of one single piece that's just bent, and that way I have a nice wide attachment point. It also gives them a nice wide stance, and then I built another wing across for strength. Usually when I do one like this, it's an airfoil. In this case, if you look carefully, it's leaned up just slightly, and that makes it a lift-generating object. So, in addition to that, we have the skis, and given that this is my motor, I have tons of prop clearance. That's all good. So everything's been checked and rechecked. The balance of it is very good. It glides very well with the weight of the motor and stuff on it. And since the rest of the weight literally will be directly over the CG and will be, and the battery runs from here to here, literally. So the whole thing is very nicely weighted so that it will get a really good CG. And then I'll be able to move the battery back. So now we are technically completely finished the external as far as what the individual pieces are going to be that comprise the plane. This is the look that the plane will have, and I have to tell you, my roommate said the same thing. It's really nice looking. They quite like the way it looks. The other gentleman that I'm building a plane for, my roommate wants one. I've basically told him that this is the format I'd like to go with, and he loves it. He thinks this is a great little plane. For the look of it, and he's happy enough to have this one as his own. So that's actually interesting, because up until now he's basically been like, oh, well, I want a Spitfire, I want this, and then he saw this one, he's like, okay, well, I want that. And I'm like, okay, perfect, because this is what I'm building us. And he's like, yeah, and I'm like, yeah, and he's like, okay, cool. So that's pretty cool. I'm pretty excited. I feel like it's not going to need the canards. It has enough lift when I glide test it this way to not need them. And when I add the canards, it has enough lip that it actually flipped itself over backwards, even with the landing gear on, but not with the motor in it. With the motor in it, it'll glide okay. The problem is it was still climbing, which means too much lift. So I'm going to do exactly what I said. I'm going to test it with just the wing first. So a couple more quick things. Now this is a little gap, and that's okay, because I'm going to make a standoff here on the wing that's actually attached to the windshield. That's a little lip that folds over to capture the front of the wing. Not because the wing needs it, but because I want to have attachment points here. So at that point, I can put a little elastic around it from here back to, say, here where I have my bulkhead. And instead of the elastic going around the wing, it'll just go around the front of the windshield. So you will see it. It will be visible, but it'll be a nice way to do it. And that way I can just pull this whole section off very quickly, pull out, and the whole battery will come out with it. And then I can just change the battery. Now, there will be a servo right here, but the servo is on a leash this long, which means you could pull that whole thing out this far, to the rear of the receiver board is here. Well, that's perfect, because when you pull this out, that's exactly what will happen. It'll give you enough length. That's one option. But I'm thinking I really might want to go with this other option where I just make this a door and swing the whole thing open, and this gives me complete access to the battery. But the problem with that is it's always going to be on its side when you change the battery, and it's awkward to hold it like this, see, while you do that. You know, you're going to have it in your hand, and you're going to have to find a way to hold it so that it doesn't just break. A little lever here, hold it like this, and flip the door open. You got your other hand, you reach in, you open it. This is actually very much doable. Pulling off the nose is also very much doable, but will require more structural reinforcement up here because it all has to attach together, which means it's more weight. Doing the door method, really, especially if I use a tape hinge at the back, will mean it's no extra weight. And then I'll put a little tiny latch here, and it'll be a little tiny bit of weight, but not much. I'll show you the latch. It'll actually be pretty cute. It's going to be made out of foam, but it'll work. I might reinforce the pieces with a little bit of something, a little bit of plastic or something, just to make it tougher. But I can just make a little door latch, standard door handle. Turn the door handle, it swings over the lock, and it's closed. Flip the door handle back, and it opens. So it'll actually have a real door handle and a hinge. I'm thinking that's the way to go rather than removing the whole nose, because of the two methods, it is the lightest, and theoretically, it does give you enough room to work with it. Why I say theoretically is because the servo is right here, which means if you have to work on it and the only thing you have is a door, it will be awkward to get to. Whereas if you can pull off the whole front end, you have a little bit of room to get to it from the front, but you don't have very much room. And I'm thinking what I want is actually both. I want a method so I can take the nose off so that I can access all of the electronics. Should anything break there, I can replace it or diagnose it or repair it, and then have the door open here so that I can have access to just changing the battery without pulling the whole nose off. So that's the way I've decided to go. But because of that, it's a bit more complicated of a build. Every feature I add adds some complication. But I have to say, I really love it. It sits nice and level. The whole thing looks really good. I've gone over all of the major pieces now with the micrometer and thoroughly measured everything out. Everything looks really good. The measurements all come out really exact. The angles are all right. So it's pretty much ready to build, except that I need to be clear on how I'm going to put it together and how I'm going to take it apart. And it has to be able to do both. If I can't take it apart, that means I'm sealing all of the electronics inside. How do you take the battery out? I could cut a hole in the back because of where the battery sits. It sits from here to here. So if I leave this back out, you're going to have to jam your fingers right up inside the airplane to be able to get that battery out. And I don't like that. If I'm going to do that, it means putting a door in the bottom of the airplane that's here. The problem is, if that were to come down in flight, there will always be pressure, even if it doesn't, on the front of it from the airflow trying to push it open. So any kind of a hatch here is bad. Whereas, if I hinge the door at the front and have it open at the tail and swing open this way, it's a little easier to get into, but then you got this big long door in your way when you're trying to work on the front of the plane. I'm going to have it so it does the other thing, where it comes pretty much right to here and then opens the other way. That way you have access to all the electronics. The servo will be right here. You can technically get to it, and you'll be able to take the front off. So between the two, you could work on the servo on the top of the wing without any trouble at all, on the bottom of the wing, sorry, and you could work on all the electronics. But that's really the only way I can figure to do it, where I'll get access to absolutely all of the pieces. And that's really important. I want total access to everything that's inside the plane. That being said, I'm loving the look. It's nothing fancy, but it will definitely do the job. It's going to fly, and that's the important thing. So I have technically glide tested it a couple of times now. I found with even the small canards, it backflips itself, which means my wing is awesome and makes tons of lift. As predicted, this is a monoplane, guys. It doesn't need anything more than this. And done right, it shouldn't. So, canards are an option, but they add lift and slow the plane down at the same time, which means I'm only going to use them if I need them. Keith out.